What's up, guys? Doug Polk here, and welcome back to another episode of Poker Hands. And today we've got a hand from King of the Hill 2 played between Olivier Busquet and Shaun Deeb. Now this hand is pretty great, so let's go ahead and jump right into the action.
Busquet opening it up, King Deuce, Deeb making the call.
Our hand begins at 250, 500 blinds, and Shaun Deeb has $40,000, which is about 80 big blinds, and Olivier covers. Olivier looks down the button at King Deuce off, and it's not a hand that you're exactly thrilled to play, but when you're playing heads up, you're going to have to open hands like this because there's simply too much of a chance that you're ahead of your opponent. There's no reason to be a nit on the button, and while you should fold some hands, some of your worst hands you can be dealt, you got to play hands like King Deuce offsuit. He does decide to raise to 1,300, which is just about 2.6 big blinds, and now the action's over on Shaun Deeb. With Queen Deuce suited here, you gotta play. I know there are a lot of hands that could have you beat, and even a hand like King Deuce off has you kind of slightly dominated, but at the same time you're suited, and you're getting pretty good odds here against a 2.6x open. Deeb does decide to make the call, and I like choosing the call. I don't hate mixing in a 3-bet every now and then, but I think I prefer call, which he does, and let's take a flop.
Busquet opening it up, King Deuce, Deeb making the call. A little bit of an action flop. Trips for Busquet. 2-pair for Deeb. Busquet goes with the flop bet. 700, nice and small. Deeb makes the call.
The flop comes king, king, queen with 2 diamonds, and both players flop pretty strong hands. Olivier flops trips with a weak kicker, and Deeb flops 2-pair. That's fairly unlikely to be beat unless his opponent does have a king. Deeb checks it over to Olivier, and this is where we have our first decision to be made in the hand. Now, in general, when I have these really weak king-type hands, I like to once in a while throw in a check. That way, if you do check back the flop, your opponent can't totally eliminate the chance you have 3 of a kind. If you're playing someone and they're not capable of checking back a strong hand, like 3 of a kind, then you should be check raising them on the turn of the big blind a bunch, and maybe even using some overbetting when they do check back. By working in some hands like King Deuce, you can strengthen that check back range, and the thing about King Deuce is you're not ahead of any of the other kings your opponent can have, so you lose less value against potentially more of their range than you would with a hand like King Jack or Ace King. Both those hands seem like almost mandatory flop bets to me. I don't think you should be checking those too often at all. Anyway, Olivier does decide to go ahead and bet 700 here into a pot of 2,600, a pretty small bet, but the idea does kind of make some sense. On a board like King, King, Queen with a flush draw, if you don't have a king, a queen, or maybe ace high or diamonds, you don't really have much on this flop at all. And I know that that's a lot of hands, especially when you can consider he could have a straight draw as well with a hand like Jack 10 or Jack 9. But think about all the other hands his opponent could have. He could have a hand like Jack X suited that isn't diamonds, or 10-8, or 8-7, or 6-4 suited. There are a bunch of different hands that simply can't call this bet because they have too little equity against a bunch of hands Olivier can have like a king or a queen. Now, even though a lot of Shaun's range can continue against this bet, he still has to fold enough of the time that this gives Olivier a nice spot to be able to bluff. Another good thing about this size, particularly when you got 3 of a kind, is your opponent is less likely to have anything good. So by using this small size, you're more likely to get some action with hands like ace high, or if you start to bet bigger, you're not going to be able to do that. One last note about this size too that makes it a good bet size is that when you bet really big on paired boards, it's kind of weird because when you're bluffing, they're twice as likely to have trips, and when you have it, they're now much more likely to fold. So I like this bet size. I wouldn't mind maybe going slightly bigger. I don't really hate it though. I think this is a completely fine bet. Over to Deeb. With his pair, he really only has one option. There's not much value in check raising at all. If you check raise the flop here, what are you really trying to accomplish? You have to check call, maybe your opponent tries to bluff you on some later streets, and you can continue to the turn against the widest range possible. Deeb does make the call, and let's take a turn.
Oh boy.
This is gonna get ugly.
Oh boy. That's super rude, man, when you got the queen and they turn the king.
It is so rude.
And they make quads.
It is quite rude. Deeb doesn't realize this, but he's actually rooting for another king on the river.
He's leading? Right? He doesn't have a button over there.
He did lead. He did lead here on the turn.
Couple of lads getting the dailies out in the chat. Love it. Do you like my emote? Hand drawn.
It looks nice.
Yeah?
You drew that yourself, right?
I did, yeah. MS Paint on stream.
Nice. What does it stand for? Daily?
Daily quads.
Daily quads is a thing?
Daily quads, yeah. Well, for me.
For you, okay, I see.
Well, it was for a while, and then I became truly never lucky.
The turn comes another king, and Olivier has made 4 of a kind. Deeb has a boat, and he's only beat if his opponent has aces or a king, but that is the case here as Olivier does have quads. Here's where the hand starts to go a bit off the rails. Deeb now decides to lead a little bit under half pot. I have to say I'm really not a fan of this play. First off, even though this card might be a little bit better for Deeb in some ways because he's more likely to have connected with the flop when he calls a bet versus when Olivier bets, at the same time, he will not have nearly as many kings because he's going to raise a lot of them on the flop to try and get some value. Also, he can't have aces pre-flop, which kind of matters too. He doesn't have quite as many strong holdings. And I guess my main problem with this bet is what exactly are you trying to accomplish? I mean, when you have a queen here, you want your opponent to try and bluff, and you really can't allow them to do that with this bet. If you do bet here, I'd recommend a smaller size, but I think you should probably just go ahead and check. You want your opponent to have as much room to bluff as possible, and when you bet here, Olivier is going to fold if he doesn't have anything, maybe occasionally float some kind of draw or ace high, but in general, you can get away from it. You don't want that when you have a middling made hand like this. You want to give your opponent more room to try and come after you. Anyway, Deeb does bet 1800, and now over to Olivier, kind of an interesting spot. You know, you could make an argument here for Olivier to both call or raise. I can see some merit for both. It doesn't really look like a king to me when Deeb check calls the flop and leads. I think if he has a king, he's probably going to trap the turn, and he's also going to raise a bunch of his kings on the flop to try and get some value. So it does look like a bluff or a queen, even though I'm not totally on board with it. In fact, it's kind of weird to talk about what this hand looks like because I don't think you should be doing it with anything, but it does look more like a queen or a draw, especially when you have that last king. Ultimately, Olivier decides he wants to call and let his opponent have some room to bluff the river. So he does make the call, and let's take a river.
All right, so now where do you think Deeb thinks he's at here on the turn?
I don't know, man. Leading here, like, it's kind of awkward, right? Because now he's like, okay, well, he's going to value bet, I guess. But, like, what is he he wants to get called by ace high, I guess? Like, what does he really want to get called by? You think he's going to check? Yeah?
Yeah.
I mean, that definitely does make more sense than betting. But looks like he's reaching.
He's about to get some bad news. By the way, Busquet improves to a full yacht, pairing his deuce on the river.
The river comes an offsuit deuce, and now Deeb has still just a queen and decides to bet again for 4,500. I really don't like this play at all. What is he trying to get value from with this bet? What hand can possibly be behind and call? What hand that can possibly be ahead? What hand that's ahead can possibly fold? There's no way Olivier can let go of a queen. There's no way he could call a hand like sevens. This is simply just not a good bet. A good rule for you guys at home is, in general, if you're in a spot where if you bet on the river, they can only continue with better, you should probably not be betting unless you're bluffing. I'm totally okay with this move if he has 10-9. I don't know if I'd be taking this line, but if he wants to fire at it with one of his worst hands, sure, totally okay, and you can always balance it out by using a king in his range as well. Can't do it very often because you can't have very many quads, but once in a while, sure, why not? But when you're doing this with just kind of the middle of your range and you can't get your opponent to call with a lot of worse hands, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And I think actually one of the best things about his turn bet is that he should check the river to make it look like he might have some kind of misdraw that's going to give up. If you're going to bet the turn with this hand, you got to check the river and let your opponent have a chance to bet and try and bluff you. And then if they do have a good hand like a queen or a king or aces, something that either chops or beats you, especially when you're beat, you're going to lose a lot less than you would lose if you bet here and, I don't know, get raised, because I think that's going to happen.
Seems like you just get chopped a lot. You just end up chopping a bunch of the time.
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure what he's hoping for this bet to accomplish, because if Busquet has a queen or better, he's going to call a raise. And if he has worse, he'll probably fold. So I don't see much value here. More importantly, though, I think we might have a new high hand.
I really hope they call it out in the 50K.
Why do I always do this to myself?
And Deeb has sailed his boat into stormy seas.
Hilarious joke. When are they going to get some real talent in the booth?
Got a good question here from the chat. Doug, have you thought of calling it Parker hands?
That is a good question.
I'm not, but I can see why.
Wow, this is only to 11,000 as well. Oh.
Olivier decides to go ahead and raise to 11,000 here, and I love his size. In general, in spots where you're representing something very polarized, you want to go big unless card removal plays a big role. Well, here, if he goes too big, he has kind of a problem. If he starts bombing it here with quads, then his opponent can decide to continue with hands that are mainly quads, which he doesn't have. So bombing it here with quads is going to get a lot of folds from your opponent. It also means that you can't really bluff, because if your opponent has quads a bunch of the time, it's not really going to be a very fun spot for you to be bluffing your opponent, because when he has quads, guess what? You're going to get the business. So in this situation, you want to use a small raise size and put your opponent in some tough spots with maybe if they do have a queen, but also if they don't have that in their range, you're not going to get burned by having a huge size. The action's now back over to Deeb, and he's just put himself into a terrible spot here. The raise is a small size, 11,000, so he's going to have to call something around 50-60% of the time, either call or raise, in order to defend against bluffs. The problem here for Deeb is that he might also have some hands he wants to bluff. Let's say he's going to take this line with a hand like Jack 9 or Jack 10 or a missed flush draw, anything like that. Well, if he doesn't also call a raise with a queen and he folds those bluffs to a raise, he's going to fold way too much facing a raise. This is really the problem with this strategy. It's hard to find hands that really make sense to bet in Deeb's shoes. And this is one of the reasons why you should be checking a bunch out of position. So Deeb's gotten himself into a terrible spot. It's not clear what he should do, but can he find a way to figure out that his opponent has 4 of a kind?
Because there's not really much reason
paid.
for queens to bet.
No, he can't.
So, because there's not really much reason
paid.
for queens to bet.
Biggest pot of the match, I believe.
That is by far the biggest pot. A $30,000 pot goes Olivier's way. He now moves into a comfortable lead here. 3-1 chip edge.
Good time.
Cruising altitude.
Now this match is from King of the Hill 2, and I want to give you guys a friendly reminder. King of the Hill 3 is on its way. If you guys are interested in checking that out, it's going to be on October 25th and 26th over on Twitch at Poker Night TV. Thanks for joining me for today's episode of Poker Hands. And if you enjoyed this video, hit that thumbs up button. And we're going to be doing a lot more videos here on the channel now. So make sure to subscribe and don't miss any videos.